on today's StoryBeat.
Something that really, in retrospect, gave me a breakthrough was writing for an anthology. This publisher said, "Well, do you have a book?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, I have a book." So they said, "We'd like to see it." The anthologies can really sort of introduce you to people, to publishers, not only to other writers, and it can be very much worth doing.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, L.A. Starks, is the author of the award-winning Lynn Dayton thriller series that includes 13 Days, The Pythagoras Conspiracy, the multi-award nominated Strike Price, The Second Law, and the recently released Winner's Curse. I've read Winner's Curse and can tell you it's an exciting adventure into the high-stakes world of the oil and gas industry, with corporate intrigue, sabotage, and ruthless, power-hungry characters around every turn. If you like thrillers, be sure to check out Winner's Curse. L.A. earned a degree in engineering at Tulane University and an MBA at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Besides writing high-stakes thrillers, she's also a paid contributor to Seeking Alpha for her energy investment articles. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a truly great honor for me to welcome the outstanding novelist L.A. Starks to StoryBeat today. L.A., thanks so much for joining me.
I'm delighted to be here, Steve.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here with me. So let's go back in time a little bit. Where did you first start to think of yourself as a writer? Did you start as a young person, or was it later in life?
I had always read a lot, and as do most writers, and authors were my heroes. In high school, I thought, oh, this is something I would really like to do. I grew up in a refinery town, like a technical suburb of, not unlike maybe perhaps a technical suburb of Pittsburgh.
Right?
So when I started to look around and think, well, what can I do and how can I make a living? The answer was, well, you can't, and not at least doing freelance novelists. And the examples of lots of scientists and engineers were all around me. So it sounds odd, but it made perfect sense for me that my plan B was to go into engineering. And I did, and I do. I love it. It kind of branched out into finance. That's the whole energy bit.
Right?
But I always, in college, I wrote for the paper. I thought about going to journalism school. I got to a point where I could say, okay, I've got some time. Let me see if I can do this. So that's what I did.
So you've been writing since you were quite young. This was not something late in life to you.
This was full time, was later in life, but I've always wanted to write, and I finally had the opportunity.
hmm And were you someone who early on in life you were actually writing things down and creating stories, if not on paper, at least in your head? And this is something that came naturally to you.
I was making observations and I was writing things down. I always kept a journal and I thought, well, these are some interesting people. These are some interesting character situations. And I really did think, and I did initially go kind of in the direction of nonfiction. I wrote a lot of, kind of technical articles. I wrote
hmm
things about energy, but I had done like some short stories, but I always had in mind that I wanted to do, and I was kind of collecting scenes, I suppose, or chapters, for a book.
So you bring up technical articles, which I think is very interesting because it's still writing. You still have to write it in a way that someone can understand what you're saying. Do you find that there are similarities between writing nonfiction articles and writing fiction books of the Lynn Dayton series? Is there similarities or are they really different?
Both. I mean, they are in technical writing, you're trying to, persuade and kind of line out the facts and in a way that's really clear. So you're always looking for clarity and that's common to both kinds of writing. But technical writing is quite analytical. Fiction writing is really about the characters, the emotion, the plot. One example is that in technical writing, you're talking about risk, but you're saying, okay, here's what it is, but hey, it's pretty minimal.
hmm
In fiction writing is like if something bad can happen, it does.
hmm
And so the risk analysis, if you will, is different.
Well, in fiction writing, you want bad things to happen. That's
Yeah,
conflict, and
that's
you need that to
conflict.
make the story work, right?
Exactly, 100%.
Was there a point in time when you realized to yourself, yeah, you know what? I am pretty good at doing this thing called writing, and I think I can make a go at it. Was there a pivotal moment for you?
No. I wouldn't say that because only because as many writers do, I encountered lots and lots of rejection. And so it's kind of like, okay, what am I doing wrong? How, I mean, I read a lot and it's kind of like, well, why does this work and mine doesn't? I guess perhaps, each time I have a launch, then it's kind of like, okay, it's real.
Hmm.
Or each time a reader says, "Oh, I liked what, so and so character did." I thought, "Okay, I really kind of made an impression and created something." But I'm still not all that confident.
Well, I think that you're saying something that most writers feel. I've been doing this a long time as a writer, and I can tell you every time I turn the computer on, it's like, okay, what am I going to do today? And there's the infamous the tyranny of the blank page or the blank screen, and you have to fill it up with something, and you may or may not know how you're going to get there. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. The one thing I have learned is, and this is because I like sort of complicated situations and plots, is that I have to have an outline. In my first book, I wrote myself into so many corners so many times, and it was like you can't, a book is sort of complex, and so you kind of have to, know where your characters are going.
Well, in particular, thrillers or detective stories or those kinds of stories, those genres, if you don't know where you're going, it's really easy to get lost down a weird side streets. And that's what you're talking about. You got lost. Yeah?
Exactly. Well, and I would write, there would be these characters, and I think, oh, this is like a really cool, character, and I want to really put something in about them. And then, they would go nowhere. I mean, they wouldn't come back, they wouldn't add to the story, all that stuff you have to, some of us at least have to grind through it and do it wrong so many ways before we get it right.
So why thrillers? How did you get to writing thrillers? Is that something you always read?
I did. I have always liked mysteries and thrillers. It's fun because they're global, they're high stakes, they're fast, lots of action. And that's why the energy business is such a perfect fit because the energy business is high, very high stakes, global, lots of different characters across lots of different cultures, lots of potential for conflict. And as we discussed, I mean, conflict, really kind of drives any novel and certainly a thriller.
Well, yes, and certainly motion pictures, and we'll get to that thought in a bit. But I'm wondering how is it because you grew up near the oil and gas industry that that's how you got fascinated by it, or was there something else that drew you to it?
That's it exactly, and that's what makes me comfortable with it because I knew the characters, I knew the situation, I knew the people, and I also felt like in all the fiction that I was reading, I didn't really see, it's not a lot of what's out there, maybe with the exception of Landman right now. It doesn't really reflect the people that I knew, the characters that I knew, situations that I knew. So that was also definitely a big part of it.
Do you think going to school and earning a degree in engineering has had a huge impact on how you write a thriller?
Initially, it had a negative impact.
In what way?
Well, because all the nonfiction, I mean, you're kind of driving towards what are the facts, what's the analysis,
Right?
and also when you're doing engineering projects or any kind of projects in business, you're trying to get consensus, you're trying to make things work. You really want everybody in the room sort of nodding their heads. And that's the last thing you want in a thriller is everybody nodding their heads.
It needs to be something there's all these corners you're going around and we don't know what's next. That's the definition of pretty much any good storytelling is that it's a story of suspense. Even if it's not a thriller, we should not know what's coming next. That's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly, 100%.
And when you're dealing in nonfiction, many people will sort of know what you're getting at, and they're looking for maybe a specific answer to what you're trying to drive through. But in a thriller, you don't want the audience to know where you're going at all.
Mm-mm. No, 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 not at all. I do dozens of articles for Seeking Alpha, and I read a few, and I read a fair enough, a lot of energy industry stuff. And my readers are, I've got 4,200 followers or something.
Mhm,
They're looking at the beginning and the end,
mhm.
and that's they don't want a story. They just want a few like nuggets.
You don't think that your ability to write a thriller has any impact on writing your nonfiction articles? It's got to have some impact.
Well, I'm certainly sensitive to word count. Um, so that's I would like to think that, my vocabulary is a little spicier, is a little bit, there's a little bit more variety than there might otherwise be, for sure.
In your nonfiction, there's more variety?
More than there would be if I didn't write fiction.
You mean it's more, I'm just guessing now, more technical. Is that what you mean?
The nonfiction is technical, but you can still kind of choose your verbs and your situations, kind of carefully.
Take that a step further for me. That's very interesting. I've never heard anyone say that quite that way before. What do you mean? What is that differentiation?
I guess, for example, one of the things that I'm looking for when I'm doing some analysis is, and it's typically of a given company, who is this company?
Hmm.
What do they say publicly? What can I discern about them from what they're not saying? And what do the numbers tell me? It's very much, kind of like, okay, let's summarize this, $1 billion mistake that they made, and, say, hey, this is a mistake. And, think about that before you put your money in, into this company. And so there's this aspect of cutting to the chase.
So you're actually writing articles that are for investors in that business, right?
Yes, correct.
And so it has to be analytical so that they can make a good judgment as to whether they want to spend their money on it or not.
Right. And what's been kind of really nice about that is those are all short cycle, right? A book takes a long time, takes me a long time at least to do. And then, you put it out and you market it, and you get the reader feedback. And the articles, if like I had one last week, I'll get 100 comments on it. And, they'll go in all different directions. And that's exactly what you want. You want these people kind of saying, well, what about this? And what do you think about that? And no, I don't agree with you. And it's like, okay, tell me why you don't agree. And so it's that same sort of like, let's get a conversation going.
Do you ever find that the articles you're writing and then the feedback you get on them actually feed into your narrative fiction?
I would say more generally that the energy background absolutely,
Hmm.
absolutely, feeds into this. There are certainly people, character situations that are sort of reflected, and, composites and all that are there. But for example, in Winter's Curse, I'm not giving away much to say that there's a focus on this water recycling technology.
Right.
And everybody wants it, and everybody's fighting over it. That's a real thing. It's what everybody's striving for. But at this point, this kind of cheap, wonderful, affordable water recycling technology is still fiction.
But you're getting the idea for the book from this other work that you do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, what are the stakes, and what's something that people don't know about, but it's big.
Well, I live in Pittsburgh, which I should know something about the steel industry, but I really don't. But I don't know anything about the oil and gas industry other than I take my car into a place and fill up. I mean, that's as much as I know. So for you to be that expert in it requires a certain amount of digging and research and so on. Is that something that you enjoy doing? Do you enjoy the research part of those kinds of articles?
Oh, probably too much.
Are you saying you're a bit of a geek on that? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, this is right. Too much. The very, very important part about writing are the things you don't know about. So like the action scenes, having to block out the action scenes, or in this one I used, and I think I've used it in the other books, it's Krav Maga. So I ask a trainer, okay, now how does this work? And you want to reflect kind of the thrill, the conflict and all that's there, but you also have to really compress it.
What do you mean by compress it?
Compress in time, you excise all the
You don't want to take the audience through the entire process of learning Krav Maga and all the details of Krav Maga because that's not necessarily what your story is about. Is that what you mean?
Well, yes, yes, but more specifically, they're like a million meetings in oil and gas. You're meeting, you're traveling, you're meeting. It's like, oh, what a drag. So, if you can have a meeting in the book and lots of people sort of speak up, and there's a big fight, well, that's great. But even that you can't do too much of.
Not to burst any bubbles, but I've been in show business for a really long time, and there's lots of meetings in show business too. And they're kind of a drag as well. You want to get to the heart of it and the meat of it. I'm curious. I asked this question of a lot of writers, and I'm wondering if you're able to define for us what for you makes a good story good. Why do you focus on one story over another? What makes it good for you?
I think we all try to go to the common theme, and I'm not saying anything that people haven't said, 100 times before, but it's said that every good novel is about family
Hmm.
and about relationships. And so many books that I've read, something will be encapsulated, and you'll say, "Yes, that's exactly right." And that's what you're beyond everything else. That's what you're trying to get to, or that's what I'm trying to get to.
Is the relationships.
The relationships and who's doing what and why. So that, that becomes an important part of the character. So I mean, when I wrote my first book, all the characters looked alike, sounded alike. And as I've developed these books, I've thought more about who does what and why and how are they fighting about it.
All right, so let's dig into Winter's Curse a little bit deeper. Tell the listeners basically what the story is about.
Winter's Curse is suspenseful thriller. It's filled with energy, intrigue that is ripped from today's headlines.
Hmm.
It's a story about conspiracies to get control of a valuable oil field technology and to sabotage natural gas plants. As the first woman to lead her company's drilling division, Lynn Dayton, the protagonist, has challenges and they escalate to thwarting these very deadly conspiracies.
And where did Lynn Dayton come from? Is Lynn Dayton really essentially you, or is it someone you've completely made up?
There are definitely parts of Lynn Dayton that are me, but there are also parts that aren't. I have kids. She's got stepkids. In the first book, she's not married. She's divorced. She drives a lot faster than I do.
It's a lot easier for her to drive fast in a book than in reality.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And she just, I mean, there's certainly things where when she's thinking something, it would be sort of like my unfiltered, yeah, that's right. But she just, I don't know. She's taken a different path, I guess, than I've taken. So that's part of it.
You've obviously written a number of books using her as your protagonist. What is it about her that fascinates you? How did you get to her in the first place?
Oh, that's great. Okay, so some of it is sure, write what you know. But in writing about her, it was also like, what don't I know? What are the hard situations she would come up against? And, how would she deal with them? So I kind of think that that's it. But, there's certainly people who would say, oh, it's just wish fulfillment. And maybe that's true too.
So she's taking on the role for you of the character who is confronted by the unknown, and how does she deal with that unknown?
Well put.
Okay, so are there other authors that you've read that you admire that sort of helped you to get to the thinking about Lynn Dayton in a series?
There's so many authors. There's so many that I like, and there's so many that I admire. I don't know that certainly there's some with female protagonists, and I taken note of that. So Patricia Cornwell, for example, or Sarah Paretsky is a huge favorite of mine, and this book has a fair amount of Chicago in it. And Sarah Paretsky writes about Chicago. Michael Crichton, he's my guy. That's I'm sort of on that path of sciencey thriller.
That's right, but he's a very clever because he always every book that Crichton writes or wrote really is the definition of what you're talking about either family or relationships or personal issues combined with some kind of science or something on the technological level. And that's where you are as well. You're dealing with this personal character along with the technical, and it happens to be the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Okay, so when you first started to write the first book, did you know then that you were going to write a series of them?
No, it was just kind of like, can I do this? And this is so hard, and I'm revising, and I'm just. What was interesting was I started out with a very very small character in a very small place, and I had people kind of early on say, "Look, you need to just make the scope a lot bigger," and they were exactly right about that. And so that's kind of took some kind of like, okay, I haven't like traveled to Egypt, but I'm going to write about Egypt, for example.
Did that force you to travel to Egypt?
No, couldn't afford that.
So you just went and did what every other author does, other than the ones that travel, is you did a lot of research.
I did a lot of research. I mean, certainly some of the scenarios, like Paris is in the first book. Well, I've been to Paris, so there's some of it that fits.
Mhm.
I've been to Budapest, but there's some that I'm just thinking, well, I need this character in this place. What's his name? What does he do? How does he sound? What does he think? What are his limitations and his motivations? There's a fair amount of Russia. I've got a Russian guy and haven't been there. So there's a lot of just kind of noodling around about that.
And where do you look for your research? Do you actually go to libraries? Is it online? Do you watch movies? What do you do for research?
Occasionally movies, a lot of it is online.
Online.
Yeah,
And I assume a certain amount of book reading.
absolutely. Yeah.
Is some of that book reading must be related to the work that you do in nonfiction as well. I assume they have some interlap.
Right, right. Although it's interesting because a lot of the nonfiction, curiously, over the last couple of years, particularly, I've got a book of kind of like engineering standards and kind of laws and thermodynamics. I've got a whole library of that. But now everything I need is online, and so that's been sort of a weird different thing.
But that's been coming toward that for quite some time.
Yeah, yeah.
You can find pretty much anything online at this point.
Yeah, and unless you really need it, and then it's not there.
Then you have to either you make it up or you got to go find it somewhere.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your process of developing a novel. You've now written how many of them? 4 or 5?
4.
4. So where do you begin? Do you begin with the characters or do you begin with plot?
I start with plot. I also it sounds odd, but what's important to me is location. Location has a lot of history and depth, and it shapes the characters. And then once I kind of know what I want, then kind of, I start filling in the pieces with the characters. So the protagonist, Lynn Dayton, will be in several of them. People have said they like the Hannah Bosco character, so she might continue. I have a rather frightening character Bible by this point because I've kind of like, oh, okay, let's put, in somebody who does thus and so, and they have a little cameo, and then they sometimes they show back up. In fact, this character, one of the antagonists, is a antagonist early on in another book. So, and then well, like with this book, I wrote it, and I worked with this for the second time, this really incredible editor, and he's kind of like, you're missing some pieces, and you got to connect other pieces, and so that's to me a very very important thing. And there are probably authors who can keep rereading their manuscripts and making them better, but after I get past like 5 or 6 rereads, revisions, I'm not one, because I stopped being able to read it as a reader. That's what you're trying to do, and so I start kind of like, well, I can.
Do you get lost in the forest for the trees at that point where you can't really see things that are either mistakes or they need correction or words don't make sense anymore? Is it that kind of thing? Because I go through some of that.
Certainly there's the little stuff, I have to pay attention to that, but really it's more like, oh, does this point connect to this point? Did I explain enough what's going on here, or why this is important, or have I included one too many meetings, which is, and a technical detail, I've got to be careful about that, because it's kind of like, okay, I'm sure that everybody actually, really wants to know how you put sand in a well. Well, maybe no, maybe not.
Do you have an extra burden because of your nonfiction work that you've got to be really accurate in your fiction?
Yes, I think it's a responsibility.
You can't make stuff up. You can't just go crazy.
I really, really, really felt that with my first book. And now I'm confident enough in, everything that I've done and written, and kind of where you can sort of, warp time and all that. But I do still think of my engineering classmates and how they would call bullshit on stuff. So
So you have friends of yours and colleagues of yours who read the Lynn Dayton books, and they've called you out on things.
Fortunately, no. They've said, "Okay, she gets it right." And that's kind of that's the little star I'm going,
Well, that's what you worked hard to get to. You worked hard to get it so that she's saying the right things, yeah?
yeah, saying the right things and making the right calculations and, all of that.
All right, so now you say you need an outline because I think that that's for me personally. I don't know how you would write a detective story, a thriller, an action-packed something without knowing where you're going, beginning, middle, and end. How long does it take you to develop an outline?
Well, a while. I mean, it just really is kind of how long does it take to do a book? And I have more time now, so I can focus more, but I've been doing it part time, for a long time. So it takes me a while. With this one, I had a good part of the manuscript and a very good outline by the end of last year. And so, sort of through the beginning of 24, I filled it in, I kind of finished it up, and then it still needed quite a bit of revision.
So you spend, you think, more time developing the outline than actually writing the book, or is there an equivalence?
No, no, I spend more time writing than I do outlining. With the first book and not a mistake, but there were scenes and thought, okay, I have to have this scene, I have to have this scene, I have to have this scene. And then it's kind of like, oh, oops, I got to tie them all together. And so, since then, I mean, I still have like scenes that sort of come to my imagination, but I really try to start with an outline.
So I know from my experience, no matter how much I outline something, when I start to write, whether it's script or book or whatever, I know that I'm going to make changes along the way. That things are going to occur to me and I'm going to alter things. I'm going to move in different directions. Same for you?
Absolutely, 100%. It was funny because with this book, I was writing, and as I was starting to write it, Russia was invading Ukraine. It's kinda like, "Okay, wait. Yeah, that changes things." So
Well, what would you have done if you had completed the book and it were ready to go out? You wouldn't have gone back and changed it, would you?
probably not.
So it would have been in certain historical context
Yeah.
pre-Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
yeah,
but then
yeah.
you knew it going into completion of the book, so you were able to adjust.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a little reference, like, the Russian guy shows up in Budapest and he's kinda gets the cold shoulder, and it's like, "Okay."
So do you use any classic structural plot points, that kind of thing? Do you do that, or you do it off of feel?
Oh, you mean like the hero's journey?
The hero's journey, 7 plot points. There's all kinds of different ways to think of structure, especially I'm thinking motion pictures because your story of most thrillers are like motion pictures in that way. And there is a sequence to how story will unfold in what in movies, we talk about the 7 plot points. But do you think that way or do you go by feel and how the story lays out?
Both. I do the hero's journey was helpful for me. I like that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to
Now you're talking about Joseph Campbell, right?
yeah,
Okay.
but what I really with this one, I have different situations, and then I'm trying to, like, bring them together and bring the characters together, and so I'm writing in sort of 3 different locations. So I'm kind of moving one story along and then, moving the next and moving the next and without kind of losing focus on the protagonist.
Do you develop the 3 different locations separately and then bring them together, or do you do it all as you're moving along in the outline?
Kind of do it as I'm moving along. I'm thinking, okay, so this would happen here and then this would happen, this would happen. I mean, certainly there's some like you go back and you fill in and you kind of make sure that there's some chronology and there's some explanation for why somebody's doing something.
Would you say that the development of this book has been this sort of similar to the way you've developed all your books, or have you progressed over time to different way to think about how to develop?
This first one was the one that I had the most, of course, problem with kind of structuring it.
Well, you were new to it, so you were
Yeah,
struggling to understand how it worked.
exactly, exactly.
And then by this time you had your second and third, you had a little bit of a template going.
Yeah, a strong sense of what I wanted to write about. Yeah, I'm very intrigued by cultural conflict. I mean, I talk about locations, but some of that is also cultural, and I love that. I love that in a book. I'm reading a book right now that's set in Senegal. It's like, this is great. I mean, it's a thriller, and there's lots of stuff going on, but it's fun to read.
All right, now you said that you have a catalog of characters. Is that what you called it, a catalog?
Well, they call it a Bible, a character's Bible or something. And it's this thing of, and I've forgotten who sets it up, but they say, okay, describe your character. What do they wear? How do they swear? What's under their bed? Are they married? All that. And so certainly with the protagonist, but with each of the characters, I try to do at least some of that so I can say who are they? What role do they play? Why are they important? How are they going to enter into the conflict?
Do you ever get into a book and realize that you don't need a character and eliminate him or her?
My editor does. It's like, you really don't need, 5 people saying the same thing that one person says.
Well, that would be true. You really don't need 5 people saying the same thing.
You don't.
That's just sort of an artifact of writing over a very long period of time. Sometimes you lose track of things, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, go back to the outline, and that really is where your second reader and editor says, "Ooh, you gotta tie this all together."
So then do you do detailed character work on pretty much all of your characters?
I do, probably too much on some of them. I mean, I really, of course, try to focus on the protagonist and, sort of the minor characters with the protagonist and the antagonist. There's several antagonists this time. But I have to have enough to know how the person sounds, kind of what they look like, but definitely how they speak. And one of the things I have fallen into, I like it anyway, is if you have people from different countries or people with accents or dialect and dialogue is so cool. I love the different words that people use. That's not a good way to say it, but
But well, you're saying that you're trying to come up with the idiomatic expressions, whatever the accent is. That's very difficult to do well. Do you spend a lot of time thinking about how to write a certain dialect or the way somebody says something? You think about that a lot.
it tends to be for the minor characters. But for example, I mean, I had this character and he just shows up in one scene and because I thought, well, I kind of like this and I want to, I like him and I want to put him maybe throughout the book, and he's this Scottish thug. and and after I wrote like a scene with him, I thought, I can't do this.
Too hard?
Too hard, and I can't inflict it on my readers either.
What do you do to avoid stereotyped characters or cardboard characters? What do you do?
That's where the character Bible kind of, what are their motivations? Why are they doing what they're doing? And to some extent, the research comes in. This was the hilarious thing. Okay. In my first book, I have the antagonist is this guy who attends, like, it's basically the combination of MIT, Stanford, Harvard of France, called X, or École Polytechnique. He attends that. He's graduated from that. And the nuclear engineers, all the elite of France, go to this school. And that kind of plays into who he is in the first book. Well, in this book, I thought, okay, I need to develop this Egyptian engineer, and I need to think about who he is, and he's got some conflict and what makes him the way he is. Well, it turns out that he too went to École Polytechnique in Paris, and that was like, okay, yes, he did. That's true to life, but that's I had no idea until I started trying to think about who he was.
That's sort of a happy discovery, I guess, or happy.
It was easy.
It was easy to get in.
It was fun. It was a surprise.
Well, like you say, you're going to write what you know, and you're going to write things that are somewhat easy for you to understand so that you can explain it to the audience in some hopefully entertaining way.
Exactly.
Can you tell, as you're writing, during the writing process of the book itself, can you tell whether the story is working?
No.
You need to wait till you get to the end and look back.
Yeah, and it's the issue with coming at it from an engineering background. It's kind of like, well, I think this thing about being buried in sand is really cool, but have I really written it in an interesting and exciting and accessible way? You were asking earlier about kind of words and dialect, and that is a fun thing. I do bring in kind of the West Texas and the Midland, patois, and it is its own language, and it's fun.
Do you find that as you're working through the book, the characters start to talk to you?
Yes. not like while I'm asleep or doing something else, but as I'm and I think probably, lots of writers and screenwriters have this. You're kind of writing and you say, "Okay, he says this, and she says that, and he says," and it's kind of so you do get the sort of like the back and forth.
Have you spent a lot of time in the oil fields?
I've spent a lot of time with people who are in the oil field. So my background is I worked as a refinery engineer. So that the first 3 books really kind of very much pull from that background.
Okay, so let's stop for a moment for the audience that doesn't know, including me. What does a refinery engineer do?
When you get oil out of the oil field, you can't put it in your car. You can't pipe it directly to a ship. You can't put it in a jet engine. So what you have to do is you have to clean it up, and you have to take out the metals, you have to take out the sulfur, and then to make these useful fuels, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, marine diesel, you add hydrogen often, particularly for gasoline. And then you separate. So the oil is this mix of like material from one carbon to like maybe 50 carbons, 50 carbon molecules, big mix. And so also what you're doing is you're separating sort of by size of molecule. Some of the most useful things that come out of oil and gas are plastics, and they all come out of a C2, an ethane, ethylene thing that comes out of oil. So you're distilling, separating, and making the oil more useful.
As an engineer, are you literally doing the distilling? Are you standing there and distilling it yourself? Or are you instructing others what they need to do?
The oil refineries are, most of them are, the oldest ones are about 100 years old, and they get debottlenecked and improved and updated constantly. So I was a tech service engineer, and the next step up was an operating engineer. The guy who was my mentors were operating engineers, and they instructed the operators. So the operators were the union guys, and the engineers were the ones who said, okay, this is what's going on. These are the adjustments we need to make. And then the operators would actually make them.
Okay, so now I've had a little bit of an education on what a refinery engineer does. And how did you think to yourself, I could take that and not make it boring? I guess you do it by making it a thriller, but how did you get from there to writing, a thriller?
Because I had a detour through consulting, engineering consulting.
Hmm.
So I did refining engineering, I did planning, engineering consulting, marketing. So I sort of across the board. And in the consulting, one of the things I learned is I worked with these guys who were experts, expert witnesses. And there are many, many things that present safety issues
Hmm.
in a refinery. So, like when I worked as an engineer, every week you'd have a safety talk. It's like, okay, this is so boring, but you need it because you're basically dealing with rocket fuel all the time, every day,
You could die real quickly.
and people have. And so it's not that much of a leap to say, okay, here are these accidents, here are these problems, here are these things we're trying to prevent, or in some cases, here are things that have happened, to go to, well, what if we did that deliberately? What if we sabotaged? And
Ah,
so that was actually a pretty easy leap, unfortunately.
now that's narrative storytelling. What if we actually did something nefarious?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
That's very good. That's very good. So, what do you think are a few of the things that a successful novelist must do in order to attract a publisher?
Well, I think you have to have a good story. It has to be well done. It has to be attractive, and by that I just mean visually attractive, no mistakes, all that kind of stuff.
You're talking about the physical act of writing itself, the craft of writing.
So somebody has asked me, what do you mean engineers and writers are similar? And they're similar because we're in both crafts. We're very OCD. Engineers are very OCD about math and calculations and will the bridge stand up and all that. Writers are very OCD, and reasonably so, about words and how they sound and what they mean. And getting that right, I think, is really important. It's a real starting point.
You think most engineers, I would hope so, that in a case of an engineer that's working in a place where people can get hurt or killed, that they better be OCD to a certain extent.
You want them to be. Absolutely, 100%. Yes, yes, you want them to be
And
very.
that also helps as a writer. It really does because it's all about the details. You want to have it read in a very fast and furious way. You want it to be entertaining, but those details count, and that requires a certain amount of obsession about getting those details right.
You know the mistakes that people can make and have made.
So a lot of professional writing, and you're now a professional writer, for after years of doing it, it comes with a certain amount of built-in pressures. I assume you have deadlines that you must meet if you're working under a contract of some kind. How do you deal with pressure? Or even as an engineer when you're dealing in a refinery, how do you deal with pressure?
Mm, by walking away from it.
Oh, really? Just walking away?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm oversimplifying. I mean, one of the things I do, I've made a point. I'm fortunate to have the time to be able to work out. So I run. I've run half marathons, and that's as people say, touch grass. I mean, it's a getting outside, doing something completely different, something physical, and that has my whole life has really been important for me.
You need separation from the work itself.
Absolutely.
Got it. I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier in the show. I think Winter's Curse read, as I read it, to me, it read like a movie. Have you tried to get it produced? Have you been approached by producers? Have you gone to producers?
That would be the fantasy. No.
You have a strong female protagonist, and it's in an unusual setting that we don't normally see in movies and TV shows. Although there's a new Billy Bob Thornton series out that takes place in the oil fields, but nevertheless, it read like a movie to me. It felt like you had thought that through. Were you thinking about a movie as you were writing it?
Truly, that's a fantasy. I don't have an agent, so it's not it hasn't been pitched, as a movie, but it goes back to what you said about thrillers. Thrillers have to kind of move along and have to and they are global and there is all this conflict and there's lots of fire and explosions.
That won't slow certain producers or directors down, but it is expensive.
Yeah.
And that's something they'll think about when they start to look at this as a potential property. All right, so I want to talk for a moment about publishing. Describe the process of working with an editor. You alluded to that earlier, that you needed the editor to give you that feedback, that really helped you in some way. What is it that you look for from an editor? What is it that you hope you get from an editor? What is it you don't want from an editor?
Oh, the only thing that I've encountered from an editor that I found a little bit, distressing was that my manuscript came back just totally smoky. So he he, smoked and smoked and smoked and smoked, I guess, when he read it.
Well, at least you know he was working on it.
That's right, absolutely, yeah. The editor looks at it as somebody who's seen lots of other manuscripts and knows what works.
Sure.
The editor I'm working with is so good, and they're kind of like, "This character that you've fallen in love with, they're not serving any purpose, take them out. You need some more action here." It's a really filling in the gaps, and it's more than just, you're getting the first reader critique. It's really somebody who's seen a lot and a lot of what works. And the editor that I have worked with, not coincidentally, has done a lot of stage work.
The editor is your first audience, unless you're giving it to family or friends, obviously. But in
Right.
terms of the professional world, they're your first audience. They're your first quote unquote reader of import. So they're giving you their point of view. It may not necessarily be the ultimate point of view, but it's a point of view.
Mhm.
And theirs, theoretically, is professional. And
Mhm.
like you say,
Mhm.
experienced by having read a lot of material. Is there something that you want more of from an editor, or are you pretty much getting what you need to make the story work?
No, I get what I need, so
Hmm.
I just feel very, very fortunate with the editor I've worked with.
What do you think that you did in the beginning that you now do less of because you're more experienced? Was it
Uh,
overwriting? Was it
right into corners.
writing into corners?
Yeah,
We talked about that a bit. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And that's because you outlined, because you've got that worked out ahead of time.
Mhm.
Because once you're in that corner, it's like very frustrating. How do you get out of the corner, right?
But the problem is you don't even see that you're in the corner until it's kind of like, "Oh, wait, I've got 150,000 words, and this is terrible.
Now, that said, it's also useful sometimes in a thriller, in an action piece. It's useful to actually find a corner to put yourself in to then work your way out of.
Oh, you want conflict and fights and, issues and oh yeah, yes.
But you're talking about story corners. It's like, well, we're down a dead end here that's not going anywhere.
Yeah, this doesn't work. This character might be interesting, but they're not contributing. This scene is, you've got something else like it.
Have you ever found yourself writing and writing and writing and then realizing that you're 100 pages in and now you're just starting where the story starts? So you have to get rid of that 100 pages or something like that? Has that ever happened to you?
Not really. No. Mm-mm.
That's because you're certain about what you're writing, which is good.
Well, I try to start with action. I think if I wrote historical fiction, and if I read historical fiction, I don't. But if I wrote it, it would be easy to put in too much backstory.
Mhm.
I mean, that's kind of the backstory, I think, really goes to the characters and the
Sure.
character development. And that's where you do all that.
Well, sure. You've probably received your fair share of notes, and ultimately, it's your copyright, it's your piece. I assume you have the right to override an editor's note unless there's some big egregious thing. What do you do when you receive notes? Do you sit back and absorb them and let them seep in? Do you object to things that you don't think work? How do you handle notes that you're not sure of what to do with?
Mm. I don't run into that too much. Usually from my editor, it's pretty useful stuff.
Spot on.
Yeah, if I don't understand what he said, I'll ask him. If it's something like I feel strongly about, I'll sort of discuss it with him. But usually it's not it's he's pretty on target. So,
How often do those notes help you to get to a much better place?
oh, all the time.
All
All the
the
time.
time.
Mhm.
So the work of an editor is certainly not only helpful, but extremely useful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
good to know. Well, I've been having just a fantastic conversation for almost an hour now with LA Starks, and we're going to wind the show down just a little bit. And I'm wondering, in all of your experiences, can you share with us a story that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny?
Sort of a combination of quirky and funny and cute.
Okay.
Very early on, this was with the first book, and I actually had a different title for it, which was probably part of the problem. But I was at a conference in coastal Georgia, and this woman had signed me. An agent had signed me, so I was very excited. And I was meeting her for the first time at this conference. And we're having a conversation. She was also introducing me to a filmmaker. And as we were talking, I realized she hadn't read the book and that she thought I should pitch it as a romance. And I'm like, "Uh." So we kind of went back and forth a little bit. And then she left. And I hope this doesn't bother too many people, but she left for a Wiccan meeting. Um,
Okay.
so this guy this filmmaker was still there, and he said, I don't think she's helping you. And he was exactly right. And, it was such a big deal. I had an agent. It was such a big deal. So, and eventually, sure enough, the agent and I parted ways. And the very nice filmmaker, man from Georgia, wound up giving me this wonderful blurb or endorsement for my first book.
Oh, that's
So
nice.
it was an interesting experience.
And that's interesting all the way around. I mean, the fact that she leaves for a certain kind of a meeting,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just, to go have a sandwich. It was, something fascinating. That's very good. All right. So, last question for you today, LA. You've shared with us a huge amount of advice throughout this entire show, but I'm wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to those who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get to that next level.
What I would say, something that really, in retrospect, helped me, of course, I joined critique groups, and joined professional writers organizations. Those were good. Something that really, in retrospect, gave me a breakthrough was writing for an anthology. And these professional groups will have anthologies. They're to raise some money for the professional group. although there was one that was commercial, and I submitted a short story to it. And short stories they're a lot of work,
Yes, they are.
ton of work, and it's not a book, so they're much harder to sell, all that. But anyway, so and this publisher said, oh, they published the short story, and they said, well, do you have a book? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I have a book. So it was, because it was my second book. And, at that point I was working on it and finishing it up, and they said, we'd like to see it. So my advice is the anthologies can really sort of introduce you to people, to publishers, not only to other writers. They're a very nice community, and it can be very much worth doing.
I think that's very great advice because it's not only writing, which is always helpful just to keep writing, it gives you sort of an expanded audience. You might meet people you would otherwise never have met or bring in readers you might never have ever found. So I think that's very wise advice. Any outlet, I think, is a good outlet.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
L.A. Starks, this has been a great, fascinating hour on StoryBeat, and I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and your wisdom, and I'm grateful for you being on the show with me today.
Steve, thank you so much.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.